Civil rights experts are sounding the alarm about potential voter suppression in the 2020 election. They cite voter roll purges in several states, as well as stringent voter ID laws as examples of state governments trying to suppress citizens' voices.
So in a new book, The History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, author Thom Hartmann charts the history of disenfranchisement dating back to America's founding. Thom joins us now via Skype to discuss some of his solutions and more and talk the 2020 race. Thom, it's great to see you. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you, Sagar. It's great to see you and Crystal. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So, Thom, one of the things we wanted to talk with you about is about the huge amount of people in this country who just don't vote. And that's especially amongst the American working class. Almost, I think it's like 60 or 65% of them stayed home during the 2016 election. Why is it that so many people in this country don't vote? I know, voter suppression certainly has something to do with it, but talk a bit about how people feel disenfranchised from the system itself.
Well, it takes a lot of work to vote. The registration process is becoming increasingly complex, at least particularly in the red states. And then on top of that, you've got to take time off from work. And if you're a salaried worker, it's not so much of a problem, which is why you see more of the middle class suburban white vote turning out in large numbers. But if you're paid by the hour, and you have to take, an hour off or 3 hours off, or in the case of many neighborhoods, the minority neighborhoods in particular, where they set up very, very few voting machines. I mean, we've seen 10, 12-hour lines to vote. That's pretty brutal stuff. So I live in Oregon. In Oregon, we've done vote by mail, and I think that kicked the voting participation rate up into the high 60s. On a regular basis, because it's so easy. A ballot comes 3 weeks before the election. You think about it, fill it in, send it off. We could also make voting day a national holiday.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and I mean, as you chart in your book, the conversation about who deserves to be able to cast a ballot is one that dates back to our very founding. So is it intentional that these barriers make it so hard for working class people in particular to be able to vote?
Yes, it absolutely is, and the barriers are getting more and more rigorous. Nationwide, we used to have a system of when people were registered, when they show up at the polls, determining that they are who they are by something called biometrics. You would sign a card when you first registered to vote, and then they would compare your signature. Signatures are actually, when they're done live in front of another person, harder to fake than it is to buy a fake ID. And this worked really well. And, when George W. Bush had the entire Justice Department spend millions of dollars, you'll recall 8 prosecutors. He had 100 prosecutors all around the country, federal prosecutors, looking for mostly Hispanics was their suspicion, people who were not citizens who were voting. They spent millions of dollars, spent 2 years doing this. Great brouhaha. They found 35 people who had voted who were not citizens. The majority of them, about half of them, were people from Europe who held green cards who thought they could vote, and the other half were felons who didn't realize they couldn't vote. 35 people out of 800 million votes. Not a single person who had showed up using a phony ID or like that. I mean, this is a made-up thing to justify purging or preventing people, making it harder for people to vote. People who live in big cities very often don't have driver's licenses. People over 65 who vote Social Security issues very often don't have a current driver's license. And now most of these ID laws require your driver's license to be current as well. And then young people very often, their driver's license is out of state if they're going to college. We saw this in New Hampshire last week. So all of these are simply impediments to vote. In North Dakota, you don't even have to register to vote. You just show up and show, some proof that you live in North Dakota, and boom, you vote. And that's how it works in European countries. The idea of registering to vote is an alien idea in most European countries.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thom, I mean, we also wanted to get your thoughts broadly on the 2020 election writ large. We were talking during the break about how Michael Bloomberg is really the wild card in this election. How do you see his money and his influence on the race playing out?
Well, this is a logical extension of the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo Supreme Court decision. In that decision, the Supreme Court decided that an individual billionaire owning a politician or a political party even, putting so much money that they were the essential only patron, was no longer considered corruption or bribery. There were multiple laws against this, going back to the Nixon scandals and then going all the way back to 1907, the Tillman Act that Teddy Roosevelt got passed. And they said, no, that's not bribery or corruption anymore. That's now free speech. And one of the loopholes or provisions of the Buckley Act was that an individual, if they wanted to spend their own free speech money, they could spend it on an unlimited basis. And so thus we got this situation where Mike Bloomberg can run, where Donald Trump could kick in a lot of his own money if he chose to. Ralph Nader wrote a book about this about a decade ago called Now Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, because basically the Supreme Court completely changed the rules of the game.
And Thom, you've known Bernie Sanders for a long time, long before he ran for president, really burst into national consciousness and awareness. I mean, here he is. Latest polls have him up quite a bit nationally. Looks like he's set to win Nevada. I mean, he is the clear frontrunner in this race right now. Could you ever have imagined our politics getting to that place where Bernie Sanders could be the potential Democratic frontrunner?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Bernie was on my show every Friday for 11 years, and we called it Brunch with Bernie, and he took calls from listeners for a full hour every Friday. Politics have always been consistent. He's pretty solid, straightforward guy. But back then, I just didn't think America was there. The fact of the matter is, though, if you compare his policies with Franklin Roosevelt's policies, and particularly with Franklin Roosevelt, the speech he gave the year before he died, the second Bill of Rights speech, Bernie is not pushing for positions that were as radical as those Franklin Roosevelt pushed for. Many of the positions Bernie is pushing for are things that Lyndon Johnson was pushing for. Medicare was supposed to, over the next decade, expand to everybody in the country. Lyndon Johnson was unambiguous about that. Robert Ball, who designed the program, designed it specifically so that could happen. So, Bernie's not that much of an outlier. It's just the party has shifted to the right since '92. And I think now the party's coming back to its FDR-LBJ roots.
One interesting thing, Thom, have you seen Sanders change in any way since you started having him on your show, a weekly segment on Friday?
Not a bit. I can't think of a single issue, or area where he has changed. He has been one of the most consistent. I mean, there's pictures of him out there in the 1960s being arrested, chained to an African-American person, because they were protesting racial injustice in Chicago when he went to the University of Chicago. He's got, I don't know anybody in my life, not just in politics. I don't know anybody in my life who has had such, strong views as a young person and been consistent to them their entire lives.
So interesting. Thom, thank you so much. We're so glad to have you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Thom.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on your program.
Absolutely.
Coming up, Michael Bloomberg is going to be on the next debate stage. Team Rising weighs in. That's next.